Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I am the author of 12 books, the CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, most importantly an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And of course, most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little bit deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal coaching success, the role of experience, optimal performance practices and outcomes in the real world, with over 60 episodes now to date. Today's topic plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent to coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you could hear my excitement in the intro, changing from 11 books to 12 books. It is now official. This is our first episode since the release of How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking. And I really hope for those of you who have been listening for some time now that you did appreciate the release on the 12th of the 12th, given that it is my 12th book release. And I am buzzing. I am incredibly excited, but it is a little bit surreal because those of you who are familiar, our episodes are recorded slightly in advance, which means the release date for me, as I'm recording, is just around the corner. Though when this obviously comes to air, it is here on the 12th, which is really exciting. And this is our first episode, as I've shared, after that. So whether you are familiar or not, for those of you who are new, it is available. So How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking is here. And I'd really encourage you, as always, if you are new, to backtrack and catch up on at least a handful of our previous episodes to really set the stage for where we're going. And of course, for those of you who have been with us some time now, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I really hope you've been enjoying Beyond Top 10 Tennis and how far we've come, but most importantly and excitingly, that you've been with me every step of the way in this respect since the launch of Beyond Top 10 Tennis, in getting how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking over the line to launch to release. So if you haven't yet, you can get your copy directly on AMA International or head on over to Amazon. Irrespective of where you're based in the world, you will most likely, if you're based in the States, to Europe or around that geographic, and get it a lot sooner, in contrast to us posting it directly from Australia. Obviously, if you are based in Australia, you're listening from Australia, you choose. What I'm most passionate about is that it gets to you. And with 2 weeks now until Christmas, that is super exciting. For those of you who are into the festive season, I will definitely put my hand up to say, yes, I am. And I did promise that it would arrive in time for Christmas. You've got 2 weeks, ample time to get it. So whether it's directly from AMA International or Amazon or similar retailers, you will get it in time for Christmas, which is what I was hoping for. And more importantly, enough time to read up on how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking before the 2024 season kicks off, if you're a fast reader. But there are really some key takeaways and snippets there to look at, especially when we're looking at the season, which is really a matter of weeks away. And I wanted to take today's episode or to give some time to sharing additional insights now that you either have the book, it's on its way, depending if you ordered it straight away, or it's there to be ordered. And one of the biggest insights is that we're all familiar now with the byline that it's the power of the 8th key. And recall the 7 keys to optimize your life, which is, in a manner of speaking, the pretext to how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking, as it really uses that as a springboard, in a manner of speaking, to really show how all of these keys come together. And we also outline why there are keys in the first place, why this language, if you like, is shared in or by this design, because believe it or not, it all actually feeds back into a learning framework, which I haven't discussed until now, which is really exciting. And this is where the science comes in, but more importantly, a lot of frameworks get wrong because they're not leveraging the science in this respect. So I think it's really important to touch on that, is when we're looking at science, it's not just a thing from some common perceptions where it's under a microscope, for example. Science comes in many shapes and forms. Quantitative data has been shared over the last, let's say, 8 years now, quite extensively, with over those 150,000 inferences, which a lot of you, if you're familiar with this work, you are familiar with that as well. And this is the first release that shares the qualitative side, which is incredibly exciting how they work together, because we had to merge 2 fields, which is not essentially, or back then wasn't as commonplace, even maybe as now, but that's what we had to do to achieve this incredible endpoint. And by incredible endpoint, I mean using scientific rigor, and lo and behold, this is an incredible outcome. Now, it's really important here for me to emphasize, I think, my coaching background for those who maybe aren't familiar, because there are, whether you're on social media or another platform, there are a lot of, I think, coaches over different, I think, skill sets out there. I would encourage you, though, to head on over to AIMA International, look up Dr. B, and my background is there. It's completely transparent, especially over the last, I want to say 19 years now, yes. Which is incredibly detailed, but we're looking at, just as a ballpark, you've got level 1s, 2s, 3s in Australia, and overseas it's a different system, but it goes 1 through 5, whereas 3 and 5 are synonymous. They're just on different scales in this respect. So I've been a level 3 coach now for over almost 13 years in this respect. I got my level 1s and 2s when I was still in my teens, because it was something quite innate, and I do discuss this in detail in other areas, and I won't go into that now. But I obviously did my undergraduate degree, which, whilst it wasn't, let's say, related essentially to tennis, it was a springboard for my master's, which is explicitly in sports coaching. Now, a lot of tennis coaches will either be that 1 or 2, if it's that 3 scale system, or 1, 2, 3, 4 on that 5 scale system. And even if you are that 3 or 5 respectively on those scales, and you have an undergraduate degree, you're in a pretty good position, but that doesn't mean you have a master's explicitly in sports coaching. Now, if you do that, that's a pretty good tick. You have a very healthy understanding, because we have to put things into perspective and saying a certification here, whether it is that up to 1 or 2 or 3 or to 5, it varies from a matter of months to a year. It's not an extensive 3-4 year undergraduate degree or that 1-2 year postgraduate degree, for example. And on top of that is my doctorate, so my PhD. And for those of you who are not familiar, this is actually explicitly what my doctorate was in and or about, which is essentially unheard of. Because of my love for tennis and my extensive background, I wanted to unravel not specifically how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. This was a bonus. It was specifically to do with the technical, let's say, implications that are mentioned throughout my books, which I don't necessarily, I think, verbalize or share. Though when we're looking at this, I think this landscape essentially, or what began to unravel in this context was the associations, the assimilation, the correlations with the data, with specific technical implications, technical movements, technical parameters that I was conscious of that were not present in any coach education resource. So which means any framework that did a level 1, 2, 3 or that 1 through 5 did not have this type of information. No text had this information, no book had this. So essentially what I was uncovering was new. It did not exist in the world as we know it, which is incredibly profound, which meant I was behind developing a new technique more than on one occasion that again was not heard of, it did not exist. It was pulling together all of this data to say, if you move in this certain way, if you hit a ball in this certain way, this is not only good for your mechanics and your technique and your performance, but the best part is if you continue to do it over and over and over again, there is actually a direct correlation with achieving a top 10 tennis ranking. That is how I think exciting it is. So we pieced it all together. And when I say we, I mean with the data, and the data is that extensive in this way. And unfortunately, this is misunderstood a lot because we have a lot of coaches out there who do not have that tertiary background. So when the word science comes up, they fear it, they don't understand it, so they run away from it and say, no, I'm right. And I'm really trying to put this, I think, especially in perspective for the players, to parents and guardians out there. If you're a coach that understands, obviously, science and how it works, then by all means for you too. But it's so important because there are so many techniques out there that are still used that cause injuries. So this actually feeds back into mitigating injuries as well. And so this entire pathway that we talk about that's covered over these 10, 11 now texts specifically in tennis, with my 12th text obviously, or it was actually my 11th, was my first fictional release. But what this looks at is this feeds back now to that learning framework that I touched on. So when we're looking at the learning framework, we have to consider how a child learns to how an adult learns, and how we can learn a new skill, how we can condition a new skill. And there's all these little tweakings here because we've got different personalities, whether you're an introvert, whether you're an extrovert, how that obviously triangular relationship works, that coach-athlete relationship works, how that coaching pedagogy works. There's many, many moving pieces. What your current ranking is, how do you get from this ranking to the next ranking, etc. Certain cycles of peak performance, different progressions, different regressions that we've touched on in many of our previous episodes. I won't say all, but this is all built into the books. And how it's structured is because we know when we're looking at how someone learns, which really pulls from communication literature to education literature, it's sports science literature, all of the different moving pieces. And I say literature, which probably I think maybe might not be mainstream in this respect. It's very scientific jargon. But what I mean is that the information that is out there, so the entire knowledge base of the world, if you want to think as Facebook encompassing all of the knowledge in the world, this is new. So Facebook does not have it. It is new. Or Twitter does not have it. Instagram does not have it. The social, they don't have it. OpenAI actually does not have it. It's not available yet. ChatGPT, they do not have it. They do not have access yet, which is a bit ironic because we know that the AI, how it's been feeding into different resources, gathering information. So I think it's an exceptional example by saying, irrespective if OpenAI or ChatGPT has access to all the knowledge in the world, I mean, not at this stage, but it's getting there, it actually does not have access to this because it's new scientific information, new coaching information, new player-specific performance information. Now, the downside here is that when I go to share how a player can optimize their performance, more often than not, it is sadly ignored because they don't understand the science, and or they think that because a woman is telling them, then I'm not going to listen, which I know is very shocking. And I'm sharing that, yes, this still happens. And this is not all the time, but it still does. And there's actually a chapter in the book dedicated to this, unfortunately, tied in with, I'll call it ageism. That because, no, I am not, an older male who is more commonly associated with being a tennis coach. It's very stereotypical, or there's a stigma there. It doesn't necessarily draw the parallels. Now, hopefully there are a lot of you shaking your heads or raising your eyebrows, or you're in shock. And yes, even with everything I've accomplished behind me, unfortunately this still does happen. So I think I'm using this, opportunity in a way to say everything that has been built is there to help. Everything that AMA International has built is there to help. All of these 11 texts are here to get you to that end point, which again is a world first. It's something that has never been available before in the history of tennis. And the most exciting thing, and I've touched on in previous episodes, is that there are Olympic correlations, because what this book essentially does, it teaches you not just how to become a top 10 tennis player, but how to stay inside the top 10. And that is where the 8% comes in, which aligns, ironically, in a really good way with the 8%. So it's a point of recall, and there is a method to the madness, so to speak. And what comes into that is that we know that 92%, which is staggering, 92% of active players and coaches do not know. And you might say, hey, I know. And I'm here to say, well, no, that the data actually says, not me, the data, the scientific data says this. Now, if you don't understand science and data and how it works, I really would encourage you to just refresh, upskill in this respect, because when we're looking at data and science, it is not biased, it is objective, it is data in its truest form, where you are removing the subjective. So you're removing someone's opinion. And the best part is that this data is actually based on ATP Tour coaches and WTA Tour coaches and ATP and WTA Tour players inside the top 200 in the world, specifically the top 100 in the world, with direct correlations with the top 10 players in the world over a period of time. And I'll call it a longitudinal analysis that has since been conducted within, I think, this time frame, so over the course of these texts. which ranges from an 11-year period through to that 8-year period. So it is actually quite extensive. Now, you can use obviously data in different ways, shapes and forms. Now, current players on the ATP and or WTA Tour use data in different ways. So specifically from a percentage point perspective, where is my opponent, let's say, hitting the ball most of the time? What are their weaknesses? How can I use my game to a detriment, etc. So data in that light. Now in this light, we're switching it in a manner of speaking. So we're not putting the focus on your opponent. So for the player, what this actually does is that it amplifies your performance. So if you're able to ingrain these specific technical parameters they're referred to into your game, you're amplifying your performance. Now, if you're able to build the optimal coach-athlete relationship, you're amplifying your performance. If you're able to, for the coaches out there, learn what an elite coaching pedagogy is, you differentiate yourself from good coaches to a great coach. So you're looking after your side. We're ignoring the opponent. You're looking after your side. So what happens when you look after your side? You become one of the best in the world, and the rest essentially looks after in itself, because when your performance is able to reach that level, we know scientifically speaking, which is in the real world, so I really need to run that home, that this is on real players and real coaches, real data, real information, real statistics, and it doesn't really get any more real than this. So that allows you then to, in a manner of speaking, look at where and or how you're going to beat your opponent a lot more easy, a lot more readily able to, more capable. Because when you're able to transition your game from good over to great, if we're saying a top 10 tennis player is good, but harnessing the 8%, it's great, that is an incredible shift. Because when we are looking at the top echelon of play, so the top 10 players, the best players in the world, being able to maintain a ranking inside the top 10 is incredibly different to becoming world number 2 or world number 1. And that is also incredibly different from winning a maiden Grand Slam, and very different to what we've termed as replicated success. So winning 2 or more Grand Slams. Now, if you are familiar with our text, we have uncovered all of that. I have uncovered what you need to do to win your maiden Grand Slam, what you need to do to achieve replicated success. Now, all of this ties in, and this book, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking, brings it all together. So to date, over the past 8 years since these publications have been released, it has steadily been teaching you what you need to do, what you need to implement into your game. If this is new, this all is completely new for you, this is where the current text that we're talking about, the secrets to optimal coaching success, comes in. Because over the next 6 to 12 months, your challenge is then to read each of these 11 texts then. Because when you read them from beginning to end, they're a complete learning structure, which means think of it as primary school and or high school, depending where you're based obviously in the world, and the terminology there. But what you're doing is you're starting at level 1, going all the way through to level 12, in a manner of speaking. Because for players who are, say, ranked in the top 50, top 30 in the world, the first initial texts are going to be very easy to get through. However, you're going to have these new insights to be able to integrate new practices, just like Beyond Top 10 Tennis has been sharing. If, however, you are that 12, 13-year-old aspiring to become a top 10 tennis player, you want to spend a bit more time on those initial texts, maybe 2 to 3 months each, really solidifying. And so take your time, because it sets you up for that initial 10 years of play that we've touched on. Now, for the coaches out there, if you have a player within this demographic, then you want to take your time. It's throughout the entire 10-year pathway. So look at it as a cycle where you're building those new peak performance cycles over and over again. Now, this is where it's incredibly important for me to circle back and say, yes, I am a scientist, but I'm also one hell of a coach, because I had to use my coaching expertise to fine-tune. Well, no, I'll track back. I had to use my coaching expertise to note that this did not exist in the literature. I had to use my coaching expertise to go, well, these players are getting injured. How do we stop this? I had to use my coaching specific expertise here to go, this needs to change. How can I optimize my players' performance even more? Even more so, the athletes, the players I've been working with or was working with at the time, I was implementing these key practices with them, and their performances were absolutely exceptional in such a minuscule time frame. And we're talking a matter of days to weeks working with me to optimize their results. It's absolutely sensational. No other coach I've come across has been able to achieve that. And that is how it was a trajectory, in a manner of speaking, that I had to. I had to do the hard work to pursue my master's and then to pursue my doctorate to get this out there. And unfortunately, it was, I think, the trajectory I had to take, or I was forced to take as that young woman. At that time, I was still in my head as a young woman, to be able to say, well, this is what needs to be done. This is what players need to do. Because unfortunately, believe it or not, yes, I was in my early 20s at the time. And do you think the older males were listening to me? Of course they weren't. Do they listen to me now? No, not really. No, that has not changed. So, but that is why I'm here. Because it doesn't matter if they're not going to change. You can. You can. For the players, to the parents, to the guardians out there, you can. For the coaches out there who are more open-minded, who understand and appreciate the scientific rigor behind this, you can. You can harness these tools to take your player and or players towards the top 100 to the top 50 to progress towards the top 10. This is the difference. Because typically we have so many coaches out there who say they know what they're doing and their players suffer, because we've got so many players who plateau, whether it's at top 300, top 80, and they wonder why they are not progressing. What is missing from their game compared to a top 10 player? What's missing from a top 20s player's game to a top 10s players? And this is the best part we know. It's that fine-tuned, and it blows my mind in the best possible way, because as far as I'm concerned, it should be in every single coach education text and or resource. It should be accessible to every single coach and player and parent and or guardian around the world universally, because that is also what this latest text does. How to develop a top 10 tennis ranking shows and unravels a universal coach education framework where these texts need to be endorsed and encompassed if we're looking at building the next generation of play. However, if they are not, that's okay, because if you're listening, that means you have access to become privy to the next generation of play, because this is where the data is heading. This is how we know. So, for example, we know why Djokovic is still inside the top 10, why he's still number one, why he's able to hold onto that ranking over and over again. We know why Alcaraz got there incredibly quick. We know why Sinner was able to beat him. We know, for example, we know why Swiatek has been able to reclaim her position as the number one in the world. All of this feeds back into the framework, so it's not shocking. So recall, obviously we've touched on predictive analytics and how this obviously feeds into it. Most excitingly though, how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking, it doesn't even leverage predictive analytics. It's right there for you, really sharing what specifically needs to be done when we're looking at developing that top 10 tennis ranking, because it is absolutely possible. Okay, I think that it was a really good, insight on, where we've come from, where we're going. Please, I would appreciate your support immensely with ordering, purchasing the how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. Would absolutely mean the world to me. But we want to focus now on the secrets to optimal coaching success, as promised, because today is a really important topic that actually, in an ironic way, feeds back into how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. Because believe it or not, we have gotten all the way to chapter 3, which is on left field indicators of progress. So if you want to follow along, that's on page 85. But we're going to head straight to the first segment, which is on finding your feet, sporting strengths. And I think when we're looking at sporting strength, this is absolutely one of my favorites, because typically we're looking at most players favor their forehand and or backhand ground stroke. I'm going to go out on a limb here that most players early on typically favor their forehand ground stroke. And the best part is that all of this work that I've been sharing and discussing was initially based on the forehand ground stroke. And then over the course of the past 8 years, we found new markers, new identifiers, we will refer to them as, that allowed us to assimilate, to go, this is actually in sync with, or aligns with, and or in parallel with, and or in conjunction with the backhand ground stroke. And then we started to analyze also the backhand ground stroke and these key technical aspects to these key patterns of play, and we're able to build a unifying framework that not necessarily merges them, but says if you apply these technical parameters to your forehand and your backhand, so your ground stroke overall, it also optimizes your performances. So it's not one or the other, it's actually both, which means you're more able to amplify your game, weaponize in a manner of speaking, when we're looking at the tennis god almost as a combat sport, obviously non-physical, where you're able to really amp up your game. You go, how do I amp up my game? Or I'm already doing it. But no, this is something that we know. And then again, the data says only 8% of players do this. Now, that means 8% of players, they might forget, or they might have a little bit of a blip. And that is where the change happens. That's where the 2% in the top 10 will get into the 8%, and or the 2% inside the top 10 will be replaced by new. Hopefully that's making sense here. So what it's really saying is that we know how to push players outside the top 10 so they lose their hold on the top 10, and then we also know how to maintain that ranking inside the top 10. So for a bit of fun today, I thought I'd look at the WTA and ATP Tour rankings to touch on some key players who've been able to maintain their hold. Now, we're looking at key players here. On the WTA Tour, we've got Swiatek, Sabalenka, Gauff, Rybakina, which is exceptional, and Vondrousova, who are all Grand Slam champions, followed by Krejcikova, who has now made it inside the top 10, 7 Grand Slam champions inside the top 10 is absolutely phenomenal. I am not sure there has been a point in time in the last decade where you've had 70% of the top 10 players all with a Grand Slam. That is incredibly dispersed. However, Swiatek is the only player here with multiple Grand Slam championships, which again really underscores the importance of her number 1 ranking. Although key players here who do not have a Grand Slam, we can look at Pegula, Jabeur and Makova. Makova and Jabeur have made the finals. Pegula, however, has not made a Grand Slam final, but she recently made the season-ending finals. Now, when you're looking at this caliber of play inside the top 10, that is actually incredibly phenomenal for that dispersion of play. Now, in contrast, we can look at the ATP Tour. We've got Alcaraz, who has won a Grand Slam, obviously, and Djokovic, who has quite a number. Medvedev, yes. And then we go all the way down and we go, oh, that's it. We have 1, Djokovic, 2, Alcaraz, 3, Medvedev. No other player inside the top 10 has won a Grand Slam. Now, this is an incredibly distinct difference. Of course, Sinner's getting close. Rublev is getting close. Tsitsipas has made a Grand Slam final. Zverev has made a Grand Slam final. And that's it. So 50% of players on the ATP Tour have made the final of a Grand Slam or higher. Now, recall previous episodes on gender interactions. Now, when we're looking at the caliber of play on the WTA Tour to the ATP Tour, it is without doubt the caliber of play inside the top 10 on the WTA Tour is exceptionally high. Now, when you're looking at the ATP Tour, 50% of players have that capacity to make a final, but the other 50% are not able to maintain their level of play, and that is the key indicator, if they're able to maintain that level. And unfortunately, that is not the case. Now, this is across the board, although typically this has progressively been changing. Now, the argument could be, well, Djokovic has been winning many Grand Slams, and I can say, you know what, of course he has been, but that does not excuse any of these players from consistently making a Grand Slam final. And you've got 50% of players inside the top 10 on the ATP Tour who are not making Grand Slam finals, which is really important, I think, to underscore and emphasize. I'm very sure in this 2024 coming season, there are at least 2 players here, specifically I will say Sinner and Rublev, primed for that Grand Slam final, and Rune is on the edge of that as well. Fritz is a maybe, depending on his consistency. Of course, every single player inside the top 10 here has the capacity to win a Grand Slam. However, they do lag behind, because when we're looking at the WTA Tour, we've got Swiatek, Sabalenka, Gauff, Rybakina, Jabeur, Vondrousova, Makova, and Krejcikova, who have either won a Grand Slam or made a Grand Slam final. Sakkari and Pegula are the only ones who have not made a Grand Slam final, which is really important, because even though I've mentioned Pegula making the WTA finals, Sakkari, her level of maintenance has been relatively quite high, and her performance historically over the last couple of years at Grand Slams, so rightfully so, is her hold inside the top 10. Though we do have players who have been regressing outside the top 10 and or hovering outside the top 10, but we're looking for those key performance indicators and what they need to do to maintain that level of play. And so the same applies on the ATP Tour. More often than not, the likes of, I will use examples from Rublev, Rune, Hurkacz to Fritz, are not able to maintain that level of play throughout the season. Those who are a closer, no doubt, to number one, but when we're looking at Djokovic, Alcaraz, Medvedev and Sinner, they are the forerunners, although Sinner obviously has not won a Grand Slam. He is, however, on the precipice. Definitely on the precipice, which is very exciting. And I'm going to say on the WTA Tour, Swiatek is on the precipice of another maiden championship. But I'm not going to use today's episode to share predictive analytics for the Australian Open, because typically I do not share what I've just shared. I normally dive a bit deeper, but this really is to give additional insights, specifically when we're looking at finding your feet and sporting strengths, and how these key players have found certain strengths, but how the preceding 10 books to How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking sets the scene and allows the coaches out there to underscore why these players, to understand why these key players are able to maintain their hold inside the top 10, and or why these players inside the top 10 have not won their maiden Grand Slam championship. And I say this over and over again each episode. If you want your player to win their maiden Grand Slam championship and you're unsure, please reach out. But I will touch on that a bit more later. What I really want to emphasize here is that it's so important to recognize the number of players on the WTA Tour winning Grand Slams. It does not mean one player is not good enough to win them all, like the argument could be for Djokovic. No, it's because the level of play is that extensive and that high, the caliber is that it's dispersed. On the ATP Tour, the level of play, of course, it's very high, but it's only being dispersed between, say, 4 to 5 players, in contrast to those 8+ players on the WTA Tour, which is incredibly important to underscore and remember. All right, if you want to follow along today when we're on Finding Your Feet Sporting Strengths, we're on page 90. So I'd really like to share additional insights and just pull out some key parts here to be mindful of, and they may very well draw back here. Okay, here we go. The younger a child is, the more likely their parents will encourage them to partake in more than one sport. Sports allow children to play at their freest and ablest without limitations or restrictions, unless enforced by the coaches. The most precious time of this play is that it allows children, irrespective of age, to find their feet, to experience their likes and dislikes, what they enjoy playing and what they don't really want to play anymore. A decision children innately are able to make through their experiences. This is awesome, because it really underscores play and the importance of having fun and experiences, which directly feeds in and feeds back, so it's a full circle back to How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking. Fun and play is absolute. If you lose that drive and that passion and joy, and we do see that for top 10 tennis players, which is a cause for regression. And it is not the fault of the players. It means that something just is not right within that coach-athlete relationship, which means that once potentially elite coaching pedagogy is no longer. It is an optimal coaching pedagogy, but is no longer elite. If they are still inside the top 50, if they obviously regress outside, then they no longer have that optimal and or elite coaching pedagogy. And when we're looking at the word pedagogy, it can get quite complex, but it's essentially embracing everything you need. And now you've got the 7 keys plus the 8th key, which is now accessible. So if it includes all 8 keys, you have an elite coaching pedagogy. If you have 7, not 8, you have an optimal coaching pedagogy. If you have your player that you're able to maintain inside the top 10, inside that 8%, we know with the data that you're privy to an elite coaching pedagogy. However, if your player regresses outside the top 10, we know there's been a blip. So there's something that has been weakened, that is something that has not been attended to and or has become excluded from that coaching pedagogy. So it is incredibly important that it works in tandem with a player's performance. Now, this obviously wraps back into experience. And whether you are privy to the 7 keys and or 8 keys and or if you're missing a key, we know the differential. So to learn what those keys are, the initial 7, that's where the 7 keys to optimize your life come in. And then to learn how to unify them to develop that top 10 tennis ranking explicitly is where how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking comes in, because all 8 keys are absolutely essential to be able to not only just hold on to that top 10 tennis ranking, but it's a springboard to winning that maiden Grand Slam. So the 5 players on the ATP Tour plus inside the top 10 have not made or secured their maiden Grand Slam championship and or that final. And for the WTA players, you've got 2 top 10 players, which is absolutely incredible because it explicitly shows the differential there between the 8% and the 2%, which is a very big secret here. Because what is the differential here between 8 having won a Grand Slam and or making the final of a Grand Slam to those 2 that are yet to make a Grand Slam final? And there is a very key differential here, and it obviously aligns with not only their specific performance to their patterns of play, but also their coaches' specific pedagogy in practice and what's missing. But it also sets the foundation for the year ahead. Now, we have key markers that actually I've touched on sets Bagula up for this 2024 season. There are also key markers here that we've got Krejcikova, for example, back inside the top 10 after she slightly regressed. Is she going to continue to progress? You've got actually players who have slightly been regressing inside the top 10. Now, I won't name names here, but we know for a very good fact that 2% of those players are going to be outside the top 10 within the next 6 to 12 months. They will no longer be in, which means we've got another 2% who are going to crack into and make their way inside the top 10. ATP Tour players, 50% are yet to make a Grand Slam final, which is very concerning when we're looking at comparisons, but in the lightest possible way, because of course they are all exceptional in their own right. So what we're saying is that 5 of those players, they're missing a very key ingredient here. A key ingredient to push their levels of play that bit further to make it to Grand Slam finals and to win their maiden Grand Slams. And we know with these keys and the data how, and the best part is that obviously if they get over the line and they win their maiden Grand Slam, they are further solidifying their place inside the top 10. But the longer they leave it and they're unable to make that final and or secure their maiden championship, the more likely they're going to regress outside the top 10, and they will be replaced by that new 2% to grab a hold of the current 8%, and they're the ones in line for those maiden Grand Slams to achieving replicated success. And it gets very detailed and complicated, but hopefully you can see that I'm incredibly passionate about it, because there are Grand Slams for all to go around in this manner, or in a manner of speaking, and or to reach your maiden Grand Slam final. Okay, a little bit more on this chapter. Here we go. Through experience, we all are afforded the opportunity to know. Knowing our wants clearer, to explicitly feel if this is right for us, in that we enjoy it rather than it being more arduous than enjoyable, allows us to make these decisions. Therefore, the decision-making process begins at a very early age, where sporting choices are just one of many choices children are exposed to at a young age. I'm going to wrap this chapter up on that, and obviously I've only dived into the very beginning. So if you want to find out more on finding your feet and sporting strengths, I really want to encourage you to complete this chapter, because it's really important. But on the bit about knowing and the choices, that's really where we're at. conditioning athletes and players now to make the choice whether you want to learn the 7 keys to 8 keys. If you want to be informed, to begin to learn, I think, the power of science, just like here and now in a very simplified way, as the Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success begins to share. Because then what happens over the next 5, 6, 7, 11 releases is that it gets a bit more complicated over and over. Not necessarily intentionally, but it's the nature of science, but it's also the nature of learning. By teaching you step by step the initial, I think, baseline, those foundations, and then how do you reach that next peak performance cycle? Well, we need a little bit more work, and it's going to get a little bit more complicated, but not too much complicated. And then the next, we're going to move the dial and shift it a little bit further to not only optimize your performance that much more, but we're considering your ability to learn. And as you're aging as well, you're getting older, whether you are that teenager moving towards that young adult, and or you are only beginning to learn around, say, sports sciences, biomechanics, technical implications, learning theory, human behavior, psychology. There's all these different fields in there, what a theory is, what a hypothesis is, what a statistical inference is, very slowly and progressively, because these are very, I think, complicated terms to dive into head first. But once you're able to understand and ascertain, we know that the greater your level of understanding, it also is assimilated with your levels of performance, because we want the player and coach to learn and to know. And that is why we take this 1 through 11 approach to get to how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking, because it really starts with your choices here, and it really feeds back into whether you are a child or a young adult here, or an adult for a matter. It really comes down to those choices and the ability to know. So you get to make the choice here if you want to know or you don't want to know. It's really simple in the best possible way. And when we're looking at the framework here, how to secure that top 10 tennis ranking, how to explicitly develop that top 10 tennis ranking, we have all these moving pieces along the way. But the best part is text 1 through 11, and obviously my latest release, it guides you each and every step of the way towards how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. I do confess though, we did miss out on one key part, which was that humanized approach. And I think, if anything, how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking really embraces the humanized approach in and of itself, because it's the top 10, the top 8%, the top 2%, and it actually is assimilated with life, which is really exciting. Look, to grab your copy of The Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success and to finish that key chapter today, because it's really powerful, head on over to AMA International. And to grab your copy of my new release, this is the first time I get to share this, so I'm so excited, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking. You can find it on AMA International or head on over to Amazon. Irrespective where you are based in the world, you will get it in time for Christmas if you're ordering, I think now, and or in line with the give or take a day or two when this episode obviously is out. So if you're listening, please, and if this episode has just come out, order, and you'll get it in time for Christmas, and or get it in time for the 2024 season. For any comments or questions, head to AIMA International or Topic Thread, the social platform set on data privacy. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads or Instagram. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. And to catch up on our blogs, head on over to AIMA International and look for our blog tab, or head on over to Medium. And as always, I'll leave all of the links in the episode notes. For something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. Or to view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify if you're listening on one of the other many platforms. For something left of field, visit Spruik for some random polls. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. For those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AIM International, as well as options to work with me exclusively to optimize your performance and to nudge you closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking explicitly. So don't be shy, come and say hi, and I'm looking forward to it, especially with the release of How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking. Please reach out. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I'm so incredibly grateful. I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.